B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday the 13th of March, 2020. It is a say hallelujah moment as America is roiled by the coronavirus, by the presidential election, and many other factors. Chelsea Manning has been ordered released from the contemptible sentence that she has been serving for alleged contempt of court. The federal judge who cruelly put her behind bars almost a year ago and then piled on with daily fines that rose to $1,000, trying to compel her to testify before the WikiLeaks grand jury. This is a huge abuse of power. And we heard almost no comment about it from political leaders of either party, from human rights advocates, except for the UN rapporteur. And the corporate media was virtually silent about this travesty of American justice. And we can't be sure, but it appears that the judge shut down the grand jury, recognizing that there was nothing more to be gained and that Chelsea Manning would not testify after she attempted suicide on Wednesday. And I shared that troubling report with you yesterday, just an hour or so before we got the news from Kevin Gostola, who has covered all things Manning going back to her court-martial at Fort Meade years ago. And the reports are kind of dutiful in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Under the byline of Charlie Savage at the Times, he's a decent reporter. He notes supporters of Manning had believed that the grand jury was not set to terminate on March 12th, raising the prospect that prosecutors and the judge decided to shut it down early to bring the matter to a close. None of these papers put in context that Chelsea Manning already testified in her own court-martial. She was totally honest, revealed everything they asked her about. And after Obama commuted her sentence, the criminal justice system should have nothing to do with her in the whole WikiLeaks arena. But this was a contemptible move under the guise of a contempt citation. Now, hacker Jeremy Hammond, who had been brought to Alexandria, that's in Virginia, where Manning has been held. Hammond is serving his own sentence for hacking, but he was brought before the grand jury apparently on Wednesday, and they asked him a bunch of questions which he refused to answer. And I want to salute Natasha Leonard, who writes about prisons and the criminal justice system, or should we call it the justice system that is criminal? Writing at The Intercept, she channels the kind of outrage that I certainly feel. She notes that the judge kind of clinically said the court finds Ms. Manning's appearance before the grand jury is no longer needed, in light of which her detention no longer serves any coercive purpose. Well, it never did. And even the piling on of the fines didn't serve any coercive purpose. It was punitive. And that is a violation of the standards of the court under the contempt, language and concepts. And Leonard writes, the day before the hearing, the day after she made an attempt on her own life, the judge ruled that she's no longer needed. The court didn't recognize that she is incoercible, nor that her detainment had become punitive. Indeed, a profoundly punitive element of her treatment will remain even after her release. The judge denied a motion to vacate the exorbitant fines that Manning faces. Now, yesterday, I overstated the amount of those fines. I said it was about $500,000, and it's about half of that, $256,000. And I was on Facebook last night with constitutional law professor Marjorie Cohn, and we both agreed that we would contribute to reduce those fines, and hopefully the public will pay the fines for Chelsea Manning. In the show file for this podcast, I have linked to the GoFundMe page, where they've already raised, when I looked this morning, it was about $65,000. And your humble host is going to add $100 to that total. And if you are financially able, I urge you to contribute as well. It will show the government, and I hope people in this nation, that there are thousands, if not millions, of people who support Chelsea Manning, who object to the extradition attempt of Julian Assange from London under the Espionage Act. And I invite you, if you haven't already, to listen to the interview I posted earlier this week with the Consortium News editor and reporter Joe Laria, where he recaps artfully the preliminary hearings in London over the extradition of Assange to the United States. I want to thank Linda Lewis for compiling today's quick summary of the COVID-19 epidemic in the United States, pandemic around the globe. The U.S. has 1,700 confirmed cases of the coronavirus. The death toll is now at 41. And I heard Rush Limbaugh minimizing all this today, saying that the media doesn't tell you about all the people who have recovered. Well, the issue here is that we are in the early stages of this. This is where this kind of silent, creepy crawler, it's invisible. This is where it's being transmitted. And people won't know for 5 days to 2 weeks if they've actually contracted it. Some people are asymptomatic for longer than that, but they can infect others. And so while I do agree that the corporate media is overhyping this and exaggerating the fear, it's fair to say that America is going to shut down. Already, virtually all public events have been canceled, schools, universities across the country. And it's interesting because my secret studio is very close to the UPS depot for this county. And it is completely shut down today. I went to the UPS website. It says they're still operating, but not out of San Rafael, I can tell you that. And I did see a FedEx truck on the street, so apparently they are still in operation. Also, the stock market did rally today and recover most of the losses from yesterday, which means that we're just down 20%, not 30%. And the wild ride in the markets is something that I think we're going to have to get used to, at least for the foreseeable future. So Trump is holding a news conference. I guess it's over now, but I haven't been able to watch it. I've just picked up quick summaries from Linda Lewis and the anticipated reports. He declared a national emergency over the outbreak. He asked for another $50 billion from Congress to address the relief efforts. We have 34 states that have declared states of emergency. But despite all that, California and other states have begged the Trump administration to relax the rules on Medicaid to more freely respond to the coronavirus crisis by expanding medical services. But so far, that permission has not been granted. It appears they're just ignoring the request. In previous emergencies, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, this happened, and it wasn't controversial. And there are a lot of people who also note that they're going forward with cuts to food stamps, the SNAP program. And you see, at least the impact of this, is that they don't care if people die. They don't care if people suffer during what is going to be an almost depression over the next month to 6 weeks. where people are unable to work. Those who have, permanent jobs with benefits will be okay. They qualify for unemployment insurance. But a lot of people are going to be left in the lurch. There's a huge gap in not only wealth and income, but in the access to health care and other services that people who don't have a good income and a job with great benefits, they just don't have that. And this is what those of us on the progressive left who support Bernie Sanders have been saying for a long time. National Nurses United, in a letter to Mike Pence, said, at the moment we have a fragmented, broken public health infrastructure, woefully unprepared for COVID. And they have a list of proposals, you might call them demands. Ensure that all nurses and healthcare workers get the highest level of protection in their workplaces. Improve the CDC screening criteria and testing capacity. Promulgate an emergency temporary standard through OSHA to protect healthcare workers. That's very important. Ensure that any vaccine or treatment that's developed with U.S. taxpayer dollars is provided to the public free. And immediately pass an emergency spending package to fully fund the response to this outbreak. Now, one of the issues that's come up because Mississippi has delayed its primary election scheduled for this coming Tuesday as a reaction to coronavirus. They've rescheduled it for June, which means the DNC will deny them some of their delegates as a form of punishment. But the bigger question, which is aired out by Dominic Holden at BuzzFeed News today, is will Trump try to cancel the election and just stay in office? That's a little scary, isn't it? But he wrote a lengthy article. I printed it out, 19 pages. And I'll just cut to the bottom line here. The short answer is no. A president cannot defer an election unilaterally. Congress could make changes, but it's highly unlikely. They could try setting a new timeline, but, that will conflict with the rules of the Electoral College. And it's interesting because BuzzFeed trots out a discredited so-called election specialist, Hans von Spakovsky. You remember him? Well, he's now perched over at the Heritage Foundation, but under the Bush administration, he was charged with developing and operating the voter suppression schemes as he pretended to work for, what is it? It's a government agency that is supposed to monitor elections in this country. One of the things that I didn't get around to mentioning yesterday in criticizing Trump for his teleprompter speech on Wednesday night, where he announced this almost immediate travel ban that is, it's got more holes than Swiss cheese in it. It's not based on science or epidemiology. It's based on Trump's phobias and his petty score settling with the European Union. And so in his speech, he blamed Italy. And he said that, many of the seeds of the current cases of coronavirus in the United States came from Europe. Well, it's bullshit. And it's really sad to see that the airlines are going to get further hurt, and there is no scientific basis. Personally, I'm not too interested in getting on an airplane and breathing recycled air at this time. But I have to concede that so far we have seen no cases that are directly related to people being infected while traveling on an airliner. Also, yesterday I couldn't find in my notes here the name that is being used to describe the region that it falls into the travel ban. It's called the Schengen area, Schengen. And I've never heard of this. It includes 26 nations, but not the United Kingdom. And even after Trump said, they don't have too many cases, crazy Boris Johnson said that, we haven't been able to test very many people, and he assumes that the actual number of cases is far higher than the official score, which is somewhere around 500 as of yesterday. Now, there is a plan. There are disaster and pandemic plans that have been created by the World Health Organization, which is a branch of the United Nations. But dozens of countries are flouting the international regulations and snubbing their obligations to the WHO. Some have failed to report outbreaks as required. Others have instituted international travel restrictions without notifying global health officials. I wonder who that refers to. And we know that the European leaders are just steamed that Trump imposed this at the last minute. The travel ban has so many exceptions, like for Americans. And, it's just another one of those irrational responses by our stable genius president. Out here on the West Coast, we've been watching the progress of those who have been able to leave the Grand Princess. Now, as of yesterday, it was still tied up in Oakland. But when I checked on my tracking app, the Grand Princess is no longer trackable. So I believe that it has left the port of Oakland, and its some 1,100 members of the crew are being quarantined at sea. And I'm the only one I've heard point this out, that this is another immigration move by Trump. Instead of allowing those crew members, some of whom may be infected, to land in the United States, he's got them out at sea, circling on the ship. And those who've gotten off the ship haven't fared much better. They are locked up but not really quarantined at Travis Air Force Base, which is about an hour's drive from where I am. And the San Francisco Chronicle, I've linked to their coverage, says that of the 700, very few have actually received a coronavirus test. And they were promised that they would be tested before they were allowed off the ship. Then they were told, well, we'll do it at Travis Air Force Base. And as of Thursday morning, most of the people who've been talking to the Chronicle reporters say that those who've asked for a test have just been put off unless they demonstrate severe symptoms. So there are some people wandering around with these temperature detectors. But beyond that, the people who are locked up at Travis can move around the buildings where they are. They can, if they want to, interact with other people who are locked down. But it is in no way a true quarantine, and those who are locked up there are at risk of infecting each other. Congresswoman Katie Porter, a Democrat from Southern California, really distinguished herself yesterday as she took on the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Robert Redfield. And she peppered him with questions until he gave in. So she said, Mike Pence says that we're going to test everyone who wants to be tested. And Redfield said, well, I can say that we're going to do everything to make sure that everyone can get the care that they need. Porter interrupting. Nope, not good enough. Redfield deferred committing to Porter for several more questions, saying he was waiting for the CDC to operationalize payments for testing. You don't need to do any work to operationalize, Porter said. You need to make a commitment to the American people so they can come in and get tested. And Redfield, probably thinking that Trump is going to tweet his dismissal any minute, said, well, I think you're an excellent questioner. So my answer is yes. Now, the devil in the details is, will this actually come true? And when will we develop sufficient capacity to test those who critically need it and hopefully those who want it for reassurance? And then who's going to pay for it? Whitney Webb at Mint Press News has an interesting angle, following up on what I told you, that the Trump administration has classified as national security and secret the information related to the government's response to the contagion. And the order was made, we're now told, by the National Security Council leader, Robert O'Brien, in mid-January. Health and Human Services officials, with appropriate security clearances, held meetings at the SCIF. These are the rooms that, have been swept for bugs and all that, usually reserved for intelligence and military operations. We speculate that the decision to declare all this stuff secret is to prevent potential leaks of information so that the White House can try to control it. But it is a ridiculous effort, and clearly events are overcoming their efforts to keep it all in check. In a New York Times dispatch from Italy today, we get a grim preview of what we might be in for in the United States. Now, again, I don't want to, add to fears and just try to sensationalize this. And maybe some of the mitigation efforts that we're taking right now to cancel public events, to practice social distancing, maybe that will reduce the impact here in the United States. But in Italy, it's devastating. They're making triage decisions about who gets care. That leads to some elderly people and others who they don't think are going to make it to be denied care. And it's gruesome decision-making for the doctors and other medical officials involved. A quote from a doctor, Danielle Maschini, "The war has literally exploded. Battles are uninterrupted day and night. The situation is an epidemiological disaster that has overwhelmed the healthcare system." And here's another quote from Massimo Galli, Director of Infectious Diseases at a university hospital. "The outbreak has put hospitals under a stress that has no precedent since the Second World War. If the tide continues to rise, attempts to build dams to retain it will become extremely difficult." Our listener and subscriber, John Zweibel, emailed me yesterday to underscore and ask me to emphasize to you that Trump's proposal for a payroll tax cut will blow a big hole in the revenue stream for Social Security and Medicare, and it would have a very limited impact because it would be paid to people who are being, who have regular jobs, who get paychecks, and whose payroll taxes are deducted there. But the people who are most vulnerable, starting with the homeless, starting with the unemployed, the chronically unemployed, those who are disabled and in poverty, those are the people we really need to be addressing. Now, this one's kind of funny. And the first report that I got was from Trevor Noah on The Daily Show last night. In Thailand, there are a lot of wild monkeys, and typically they are fed bananas by tourists. But the tourists are gone. There are no free bananas for the monkeys. And so they've been roaming the streets, grabbing food out of people's hands. It's just another consequence of the pandemic. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Clifford Johnson, Carl Howard, Susan Gavet, and Jim Garrison. They chip in up to $20 a month to support my work, and you can do it too. All you have to do is stop by peterbcollins.com. There's a menu tab. You click on that, then click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and in seconds, you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. As promised, Bernie Sanders gave a speech in Burlington, Vermont yesterday about the epidemic here in the United States. And he offered a lot of good advice, some of it similar to what Joe Biden had to say. Here's a quote from Bernie. "In the last few days, we've seen the crisis of the coronavirus continue to grow exponentially here in the United States and around the world, and have witnessed a global economic meltdown which will impact millions of workers in our own country. In terms of potential deaths and in terms of the economic impact, the crisis we face from the coronavirus is on the scale of a major war, and we must act accordingly. He said the United States is at a severe disadvantage when it comes to treating people for COVID-19 because the country doesn't provide health care to all citizens. When you are uninsured or underinsured, you hesitate about getting the medical care you need because you can't afford to get that medical care. The result is that millions of our people cannot afford to go to a doctor, let alone pay for a coronavirus test. While we work to pass a Medicare for All single-payer system, the U.S. government today must make it clear in the midst of this emergency, everyone, regardless of income or where they live, must be able to get all the health care they need without cost. So I certainly agree. And Sunday night will be the one-on-one debate. I will note that Tulsi Gabbard has been elbowed out of this debate, and she should be there. She qualified under the rules before they were changed for the third time. But it'll be Sanders versus Biden, apparently seated, no audience. From what we know, only one moderator. As I mentioned, Jorge Ramos of Univision is not going to be participating. He's the Bill O'Reilly of Spanish-language media in this country, and I'm relieved that he won't be there. New York Times has a page of graphics about the Democratic primary, and it shows that while Biden is ahead in delegates, Sanders, if he can perform 21 percentage points better in the rest of the primaries, that he could clinch the nomination with the majority of delegates, 21%. If he can improve his performance by 17%, he would receive a plurality of delegates, and there could be a contested convention. Over at The Guardian, a great piece by Ankito Rao today, taking a look at some of the Bernie or bust voters around the United States. Starting with a young woman who studies political science, a 19-year-old in the Bronx. She called Joe Biden's plan for climate change unfeasible. And she said that a vote for Biden in November would only give the party more reason to take her vote for granted. And, you know, I support people who won't be wedged into voting for Joe Biden. I will not. I have the luxury here in California. He's going to carry the state if he's the nominee. But even in battleground states, you do not owe your vote to the Democratic Party, even if you're a registered Democrat. They should not be able to shame you or pressure you into voting for an obviously flawed candidate if you don't want to. There are a lot of hashtags out there of never Biden. I see Dem exit. I hear from listeners who say they may not even be voting. They're so disgusted with the process. And I want to recommend to you a daily adult dose of irony. Not iron, irony. This reporter, Alexandra Petrie at the Washington Post, was assigned to cover the Biden campaign. And after his big Super Tuesday win last week, I shared with you her ironic column where she said, "Oh, I forgot all those nasty things and critical things that I've written about Joe Biden." And now, in an homage to the Bernie Bros, Alexandra Petrie writes, "I would vote for Biden were it not for his aggressive online army of supporters." I agree with everything Joe Biden is for. Having been in the Obama administration, incremental change, vague and gauzy nostalgia. I align with him on Medicare for some, on restoring the soul of America, and on corn pops. I ardently oppose everything that Bernie Sanders favors. With so much in common, why hesitate? Well, there's just one word for it. The Biden boys. Well, three, if you include the. My personal experience with them has been nothing short of a nightmare. My mailbox, my physical mailbox, as we speak, is full of typewritten letters that call me a lying dog-faced pony soldier. Every time I try to engage on the issues, someone challenges me in aggressive terms to a push-up contest. Do these people speak for you, Joe Biden? I want to be able to critique my candidate without being told, come on, man. She continues, this could just be me, but I think it speaks volumes. I think these ardent Bidenites have to ask themselves if this is really the foot they want to put forward, filling my mentions with drawings of the state of Delaware looking angry and sending me envelopes filled with Carter's little liver pills. I don't know what these are, and I don't feel welcome. I know that other people online have had very different experiences than I have had, and yet are still managing to align with candidates whose supporters have not exactly rolled out a welcome mat for them. Bully for them. But someone spat the word malarkey in a cutting tone in my voicemail inbox, and now as a consequence, I have reevaluated all my positions on everything. And maybe I'm a socialist, actually. I'm as surprised as anyone. Think about that before you drop another commuter train emoji in my mentions. So there's a little bit more, but you get a flavor for it. I also want to recommend a good and deep read available at consortiumnews.com today, written by Nomi Prinz. Now, I've interviewed Nomi several times. She is a Wall Street whistleblower. She worked at Goldman Sachs and a couple of other of the big shops on the street. And this was written before this week's meltdown of the market and the intervention of the Fed to the tune of $1.5 trillion. But I encourage you to read it because let me just jump to near the conclusion here. She says, if the virus has shown us anything, it's that unforeseen factors can crush the market and, by extension, the economy and American workers. This will incite the Fed and central banks elsewhere to intervene under the guise of helping the economy. She predicted that. This is a week old. March's emergency rate cut was the first since the financial crisis of 2008. It was also a clear sign the Fed is deeply concerned about the dangers a potential global pandemic can inflict on a thoroughly globalized economy and its banking system. If recent years have taught us anything, it's that the official responses to crises will ultimately help Wall Street and the markets, while leaving real people behind again. It's a vicious cycle that will only stoke inequality further until, of course, whether thanks to the coronavirus or some unknown future development, it all comes tumbling down. Yesterday, I reported that Trump has threatened to veto the extension of the FISA law, largely unamended, allowing domestic surveillance on Americans and the continuation of the Star Chamber FISA court. At this stage, we can't predict what's going to happen. The House has adjourned, recessed for a week. The Senate was going into recess, and yesterday, late in the day, Mitch McConnell said they will be in session next week. And maybe one of the reasons is that this FISA law, which expires on Sunday, is something that Mitch and the Democrats strongly want to renew as soon as possible. They don't want any gaps in the violation of our Fourth Amendment rights on a routine and systematic basis. Richard Grenell is this Trump loyalist who is serving dual roles right now. He's the ambassador to Germany and the interim director of national intelligence. We've been told he's only going to be there for a little while until they can install another partisan idiot named John Ratcliffe, a Republican congressman from Texas. Meanwhile, Grenell is making some moves as if he's planning to be there for a long time. He's imposed a hiring freeze and ordered a review of the agency's personnel and mission. I'm sure the dear tweeter has put him up to it. I want to commend the Gray Zone Project, Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, and other reporters over there. Mate has a good piece. He has been contacted by a fourth whistleblower from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And this relates to the now false, we know they're false, I suspected they were false, claims that the Syrian government used chemical agents in the town of Douma last year. It led to airstrikes by the United States and a narrative that has been embraced by the U.S. media, and those who are skeptical have been denounced as conspiracy theorists. But I encourage you to read this piece because the latest whistleblower embraces the claims of the previous three, two of whom were inspectors who went to Syria, and their reports were changed by the executives at OPCW to conform with the general consensus, which was wrong. Also at the Gray Zone, Ben Norton reports how, while we were distracted by the primaries this week, by the coronavirus and Trump's idiocy, Congress passed a resolution on March 9th unanimously, by voice vote, with no debate, calling for the administration to impose new sanctions on leaders in Nicaragua. Now, this is just the latest regime change operation. And I have to say I have mixed feelings about Daniel Ortega and the way he is running Nicaragua. But that is no basis for the United States to try again. We have failed in Venezuela. The corporate media is acknowledging now that the protests that Juan Guaido calls don't produce crowds anymore. He has effectively lost. But idiot Elliott Abrams is still scheming for a naval blockade of Venezuela. And now the Democrats go along with Trump. And somebody told me earlier this week, unfortunately, we see two distinct types of Democrats these days: chickens and sheep. And sheep-like, they all voted for an onerous resolution. The United States has no business interfering in Nicaragua or in Venezuela. And over the past 2 days, there was an attack in Iraq that's been blamed on the Iranian-backed Kataib Hezbollah group. 1 British and 2 American service members were killed on Wednesday. So the U.S. responded with airstrikes that have promptly killed 3 soldiers of Iraq and 2 members of a police force, along with a civilian who was at an airfield that was attacked separately. And we know from the round of events around New Year's, there were the riots at the Green Zone Embassy of the United States following our airstrikes in retaliation for the death of a U.S. contractor who turned out to be just an interpreter. This led to a near war with Iran, the shoot-down of the airliner over Tehran, the airstrikes that caused traumatic brain injuries to over 100 U.S. troops in Iraq. All of this is part of the effort to gin up a conflict with Iran. And it continues. Finally, today, I've linked to a lovely obituary from the San Francisco Chronicle of my friend Mal Sharp, who I dedicated yesterday's podcast to. He passed away this week at the age of 83. And I encourage you to check him out. He was such a cool guy. And I told you about the work he did back in the 1960s with a hidden tape recorder doing man on the street, very funny, set-up interviews with his pal Jim Coyle. And I want to close today with my Mal Sharp story. I was working at radio station KSFO here in San Francisco in the early 90s. And they put up a billboard campaign where they had a picture of me and Peter B. Collins, 3 to 7 p.m., and the tagline was, "He's a little to the left." Well, the picture of me was moved to the left margin so that only half of my face was showing. I thought it was kind of clever. So there was one of these billboards 2 blocks from the radio station. Mal and I went out with a tape recorder, and we just stopped people walking by. And we had them set up so that when they talked to Mal, they had to be looking at this billboard with my face, half of it, and my name up on it. And Mal would ask people, "Hey, have you ever heard of Peter B. Collins?" And most of them said no, but they knew who Mal Sharp was. And after they kind of fumbled around a little bit, he'd point them at the billboard, and a couple of them noticed that I looked a lot like the guy on the billboard. But most of them were thrilled at the opportunity to meet one of the best man-on-the-street interviewers who ever graced radio airwaves here in the United States. So long, Mal Sharp. Happy trails to you. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I am Peter B.
Happy trails trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.